The large fitness center in Gangnawa, Seoul made a serious impression with its monumentality and modernity. From the staff room inside the building, top fitness maniac Husky was reporting on social media. He told the audience that he had received a lot of requests, and so they would be having one of the popular mukbangs today, eating honey chicken and Kix beer. Husky opened a can of beer and invited his viewers to start eating. This guy's muscles showed that he was a sports freak. Of course, no one is born a maniac, and what led him to this obsession was an accident in his past. At one point, his body was terribly injured, and he even had problems with normal walking. Husky was seriously injured while serving in the Special Forces. The rehabilitation was based on manual therapy and physiotherapy methods. After that, he tried almost every kind of exercise, from yoga to Pilates, to strengthen his body, and also studied the rules of nutrition and diet. At one point, this made him a fitness freak and the best rehabilitation therapist in Gangnam. Husky became one of the best trainers in the country. But why is he now huddled in the corner of the fitness center and doing mukbang if he is worried about his physical fitness? The pandemic that has swept the entire world is to blame for everything. To cover the costs of maintaining a gym that was unable to operate properly, Husky took some measures. He had to become a streamer. However, there was still not enough money for 5 different halls. The online broadcast time came to an end, and Husky said goodbye to the viewers, calling on them to like, subscribe, and click the bell. He had eaten his fill of chicken and beer. It was a calorie bomb, and he wanted to exercise, but the alcohol was putting too much strain on his body. Husky decided to take a rest, especially since the doctor had just told him about it, explaining the hair loss by stress. The doctor suggested that he had not noticed the buildup of fatigue because he had always been healthy, but his body was now on the edge. He was advised to reduce his working hours, or else he might go bald. Husky decided to figure out the cause of the stress and relax first. It was unusual for him because he was always working or training, and if you think about it, his life had become so busy that he forgot how much he loved the Miriam novels as a child. He was raised by his grandparents, who were never particularly wealthy. Husky often borrowed martial arts novels from the corner bookstore. These moments became precious memories for him. Husky remembered how his grandfather constantly scolded him. Here he found the works of his favorite author on his phone and remembered how much he loved them before. He found a new episode of Shaolin Monk Chronicles with the main character Jin, who has just entered the Shaolin Temple. He decided to read a little to feel relaxed. Husky couldn't even remember the last time he had rested. Memories from his childhood came flooding back into his head. Without realizing it, Husky fell asleep. He woke up because someone was waking him up, inviting him to morning training. Husky opened his eyes and saw a child in front of him, who was very excitedly urging him to hurry up and go to training because the others were already there. The coach couldn't understand where the child came from in his apartment, who he was, and why his head was shaved. This strange guy replied that he was older and bigger than him. Husky thought that the guy had vision problems because he was 180 centimeters tall and weighed 90 kilograms. The Husky looked around carefully and noticed that this was not quite his home. But what surprised him most was that there was no hair on his head, and he was the same child as the one who had somehow gotten here. Husky couldn't figure out where his hair had gone and what kind of old house from the TV series was this. Then he remembered that this strange guy called him Jean. It was the name of the main character of the novel he was reading. But why did he become Jin? And his body become completely different after he dozed off while reading the book? Husky decided that it was a dream. This had happened before when he read too much. The Husky gave in to the boy's requests and agreed to go to training, since it was a dream anyway. This cute boy asked Jean to hurry up, and Husky decided to enjoy what was happening. It wasn't real anyway. The teacher rudely shouted at them for being late and ordered them to line up with other shaved boys. The Husky was surprised by such an unusually realistic dream. The teacher suggested starting the training with the horseman's pose. Everyone obediently began to follow the commands of the adult monk. Husky, as the trainer noted, that performing exercises like this can only ruin your knees. Husky started working out during his rehab, and he knew better than anyone how important lower body and core exercises were. But he encountered trainers who missed the point. And when he sees such meaningless exercises as those young monks were doing, the fitness trainer inside him starts screaming. The teacher told the students that the lower body is the foundation of any martial art. And Husky thought, if he knows this, then why is he making them do this? The teacher continued to instruct the children and said that they needed to learn to maintain balance in their legs. Otherwise, no fighting stance would be successful. Husky couldn't understand the point of telling this to children who couldn't even maintain their posture, but he wasn't the type of person who would silently watch someone do the exercises incorrectly. Even if it happens in a dream, these are ignorant bastards who know nothing about exercise. The coach's soul was indignant. The guy who called Husky to practice asked him what was going on with him. He immediately received a scolding from the teacher for chatting during training. After this, it is difficult to call him a student of Shaolin. He must immediately stand in his place and understand this for himself. Husky understood that this was a dream about a novel, about martial arts, because energy can be felt even in the master's cry. But he could not remain silent and pointed out the mistake. Remembering his previous client training, he knew that safety was the most important thing. The master indignantly asked Husky, "Does a Shaolin disciple really want to say that Shaolin training is wrong?" The dream was unusually realistic, and Husky decided to play along with the master and began to speak like a martial arts expert. He said that if they used the same methods, knee injuries could become a big problem in the future, with students getting injuries with cartilage damage. The teacher replied that this was an excuse for the weak, and Husky said that he thought that to learn martial arts you need to sharpen your body and mind, and now he says that these exercises are only for the strong. Doesn't he find this contradictory? Another teacher explained that Husky had not quite correctly described the way of Shaolin martial arts. They study them to become better and achieve Buddhahood. Husky asked him, "Does that mean that Shaolin cannot help the weak achieve enlightenment?" The confused master replied that he did not mean that, and that deliberately making the training more difficult helps to strengthen the mind. Because the human spirit is weak, they seek comfort in times of difficulty, and this opens the way for evil. So the training is designed to prepare them for such times. Husky asked, "Then can honing the spirit only be done at a young age?" After all, the teacher said that in youth it is permissible to break knees in order to sharpen one's spirit. So they are suggesting to destroy their bodies now, because in the future, training of the spirit will not be necessary. Does this mean that a little difficulty in youth will allow them to achieve enlightenment? These words of Husky caused a whisper among the young monks, and the master blushed and silently called Husky a bad word. Suddenly, a senior monk came to the training ground. He was outraged that this little boy dared to say anything about Dalton's first-class student. Husky now understood what their best student looked like. The monk's furious cry made all the students' ears pop. He approached Husky and said that the martial arts of Buddhism are aimed at self-improvement. In other words, it is just a way to achieve enlightenment. But their martial arts are different. And Husky wondered how they are different. The monk replied that they were needed to protect living beings from evil and demons that could harm them. Husky asked him if he meant to say that it would be easier to defend with bad knees. The monk realized that if they left things as they were, this child could become a bad influence on the other students. But the adult students of the Buddhist group could not punish the young monks who had just joined them. He said that if he thought that Shaolin training methods were wrong, then he had to prove it by his own example. Since he says that they are wrong, then he must know the right way and then let him try to defeat someone who is trained in the Shaolin methods. Husky expressed hope that it would not be an adult monk. The monk replied that they would do everything fairly, and it would be the student who joined them at about the same time as Jin. His partner would be Harry. The monk told Jin that he had 7 days to prove his case, and he could train in whatever ways he thought were right. Then they will spar with Harry. Husky noticed that Harry is in a completely different weight class and this monk calls the fight fair. The elder monk only pretends to be attentive, but in reality he wants to crush him so that he can no longer argue. Husky immediately realized that this monk was a bad person, and the monk at that time thought that now this little fellow would not perform like that. Husky was confident that he could handle this little guy, even though he looked very menacing. The monk turned his back on him and said that Jin had decided to take the difficult path. Then he suggested that the children continue their training. The guy who brought Husky to training approached him and advised him to simply apologize to Monk Dalton. The monk immediately pulled Mike up and told him to return to his place, and told Jin that he would meet him in 7 days. Husky did squats in his own way. The coach called out to Jin and asked why he was doing other exercises during the general training without permission. And Husky replied that Monk Dalton gave him permission, because the coach is not above him. Dalton asked his colleague to leave the guy alone, because a promise is a promise. Husky told the young students that they were doing everything wrong and there would be nothing left of their knees. And they are still very young. Who will be held responsible for this? Husky, who had been training early in the morning for about 2 hours, hoped that he would get a lot of nutrients after that, and was happy when Mike called him to eat. He did not know what problems he would still have to face. In front of him in the dining room was a Buddhist menu, which was completely vegetarian. Such dishes were quite natural for the temple, but they shocked Jin. There was absolutely no protein in this food. Husky didn't understand why he could smell things in his sleep, even though the food was vegetarian. It smelled good. But he didn't like being fed only grass. It seemed like child abuse. But then he was reprimanded for chatting while eating. However, Husky asked the trainer if it was too cruel to give them only vegetables, since they had been training all morning. All the coaches were outraged by Gene's behavior and demanded respect from him during breakfast. They were so angry that one of the coaches promised to teach him a lesson. Husky thought that they still needed protein for training, and he would not forgive anyone for this because all the morning exercises could go to waste. Morgan, the head of the food hall, entered the dining room, laughing. He turned to Gene and said that if he was very hungry, he could have more. Morgan even offered him another side dish, thinking that these were just the complaints of a hungry child, and that he would be better off being generous and ignoring his grumbling. Gene asked Morgan if they had any chicken breast. Not only the coaches and the head of the gym, but even the young monks were outraged by this request. Mike asked Gene why he was acting so strangely, and if he had any problems with his head. Jin replied that they needed protein to make their muscles and body grow and become stronger. Husky suddenly thought that he was tired from exercising and smelled food, and should have woken up from sleep a long time ago. Was this really reality? He realized that he needed to sort out the situation and somehow get out of it with dignity. After all, now he is Jin, a young monk of the Shaolin Temple, and he needs to say something appropriate to those around him. He bowed his head and apologized for saying too much because he was hungry, and Morgan reassured him and thought that the guy was just tired from training. Then Jin looked at the head of the room and asked him for mushrooms or beans instead of a side dish, and the head of the room decided that the guy was definitely crazy. Whether it was a dream or reality, Jin needed protein, and he couldn't believe they were studying Buddhist scripture right after training food. Even Buddha would fall asleep from such a schedule. Husky thought that perhaps he had entered the world of the novel he had read before going to bed, but how could he get back now? If it's a book, then it will be enough to wait until the end of the plot. If you think about it, the situation is not that bad. Jin is the protagonist of the novel, so he has impressive talent, and the Shaolin Temple is the strongest in the Orthodox faction. We are, of course, talking about that very Shaolin, the polar star of Mount Tai. But there was one problem. It seemed like he was attracting too much attention. But since this is how things went, he will win the sparring and force them to acknowledge his training methods. Morgan told Monk Dalton that Gene was a unique child, and Monk Dalton apologized for him. Morgan asked him what he thought of Gina. The monk replied that he had given him 7 days to prepare and prove that his words were true. Morgan found Dalton's decision to be wise, as they were practicing Buddhists and could not punish their children for every out-of-step behavior. The head of the hall asked the monk, because the sparring will be with Harry, he is the one showing the highest result among those who came this year. Every year, the Shaolin Temple selects students from hundreds of children. Some of them cannot withstand the harsh training and leave on their own. Others learn the basics and change temples. Of all the children who come, only a tenth will get into the main temple. Therefore, the initial period, the first year of studying with older students, usually does not allow you to make your name recognizable. Harry is a rare exception to the rule. Dalton, after a pause, replied that the sparring would indeed take place with Harry, and he would correct the brazen behavior of this boy. The 7 days allotted for Jin to prepare for the sparring had passed, and the day of the fight had arrived. Gene was getting ready for a sparring match, and Mike asked him in surprise what he was doing. He replied that he was stretching before the fight. Gene realized he needed to use martial arts terminology and, after correcting himself, told Mike it was a tendon lengthening technique. Stretching is a set of actions that are performed before the main exercises, prepares the muscles and tendons, and relaxes the whole body. There are many poses and techniques that will increase flexibility and increase the range of motion of your joints. Gene suggested that Mike try this exercise. After this, Jin taught his friend how to stretch correctly, and noticed that he quickly grasped everything. Here Mike drew Gene's attention to Harry, who had a magnificent, consistent punch. He was practicing on the training ground, and you could even hear the sound of his fists cutting through the air. Gene thought he could be in big trouble if he took one of those punches and he had to go up against this guy after a week of training. But still, Jin knew one way to defeat him. Dalton approached Gene and expressed hope that these were not all excuses to avoid training. However, even though he didn't listen to the coach's instructions, Jin still had his own training. He trained in hitting the tree trunk. Gene was practicing a method that could instantly surpass Harry. Dalton allowed this method, but he didn't understand why he was also rubbing his body against this tree. He still believed that Harry would teach this guy a good lesson. Finally, the opponents stood opposite each other, preparing for battle. The genie asked the monk if they could start already. Harry looked at his opponent and wondered if he was bluffing. Jin remembered the power of this powerful opponent's consecutive punches, which he had honed for 3 whole months. The sparring began and Jin attacked Harry very quickly. In response, he delivered a powerful punch, but Jin easily dodged the counterattack. The spectators, young monks, were surprised by the speed of this newcomer's reaction. And Jin threw himself at his opponent's feet and applied a leg sweep because he understood that he could not use modern martial arts techniques on a child. The techniques he was taught could even kill if you made a mistake. And in this situation, the most appropriate technique seemed to him to be a sweep, and the next move even Harry could withstand. It was an ordinary hold. The time it took for Harry to seize the initiative was about 1 second, and Jean, having laid his opponent on the ground, made a bending of the elbow. The trainers called for Harry to get up and were outraged that the Shaolin student was not able to cope even with a newcomer like Jin. Everyone turned their attention to Harry's face, which showed exceptional depression. Some of the second-year students quickly came to their senses, but they only gave useless advice, and Jin continued to hold his opponent with an arm lock. This technique was very painful. Jean whispered to Harry that if he resisted, he would break his arm. It was better for him to give in now. The fans urged Harry to continue the fight, since the kid had hardly trained. Jean warned Harry that his joints could pop out if he applied any more force, and he could even be crippled for life. Harry was in great pain and humiliation. Finally, Jin loosened his grip and released his opponent. Jean walked up to the crying Harry and massaged his shoulder, and the winner of the sparring was clearly Jean. The basis of the successive punch attack is the fist, elbow, and shoulder. This technique helps to quickly defeat an opponent at close range and is known for its outstanding power. Harry mastered it better than most monks his age. Even some of the second years were impressed by his consistent strike. But this beautiful and polished technique failed miserably that morning without the slightest resistance. Lost to Jin, a strange monk with a strange technique. Harry burst into tears of hurt and told his opponent that it was unfair. Jin attacked him with an incomprehensible technique, not a consistent blow, and in a fair fight he would never lose. Jin consoled Harry as best he could. The senior monk approached the young men and, turning to Jin, declared that in sparring, Shaolin students must use Shaolin martial arts, and he had violated this rule. The monk asked him why he didn't use a consecutive strike. Jin replied that then the sparring would turn into an endless beating and both would be seriously injured, so he concentrated on suppression, the basis of any sparring. Of course, Harry burst into tears, but at least they were able to avoid serious physical injuries, to which the monk replied that Shaolin masters do not fight like that. Dalton was slightly amazed that Shaolin's consecutive strike was so easily defeated by a young and inexperienced kid with his strange technique. He didn't want to admit it, but Harry really did lose, although it was hard to accept. But people may begin to doubt Shaolin's martial techniques and the temple may lose its students. The senior monks asked Dalton for advice on what to do now. Dalton smiled and turned to Jean. He told the young monk that since he used this technique to avoid harming Harry, then he remained true to the Shaolin way and won the sparring match. But the reason his technique was effective over a consecutive punch was because his opponent was weak. The highest goal of martial arts is to defeat evil, which has also succeeded in this matter, and he will personally show him what the essence of Shaolin techniques is, and the real power that can defeat any demon. Dalton told the students to bring a huge boulder to the playground. Jin watched in surprise and delight as the senior monks rolled in a huge boulder that Dalton was apparently going to break with his hand. Dalton walked up to the stone and told Jin to watch it closely. He intended to show the full power of the consecutive strike they were studying. The monk concentrated and delivered a quick and powerful blow to the center of the boulder. His fist punched a large hole in the center of the stone, which shattered into pieces from the monk's single blow. This was true consecutive punching power, and Dalton assured the students that they could do it too if they practiced hard. Jin, along with everyone else, was amazed by the real martial art. This is how it should be. A force that can cut a path through a mountain, and one swing of a sword can destroy hundreds of enemies. This is a punch that explodes the opponent. However, Jean turned to Dalton and reminded him that he had said that they needed to suppress the enemy without harming him. But after his blow, only crumbs remained from the stone. Everyone silently looked at the remains of the boulder lying in the middle of the training ground. The guy was right. A strange silence fell over the training grounds for the second time. And that morning, the Arhat gym leader, the education officer, and Dalton's teacher Sydney asked him if a child named Jean had really defeated Harry with one move. Dalton answered in the affirmative, and Sydney remarked that Jean was an unusual boy. Dalton replied that he was rather impudent. Harry had studied this technique more diligently than others. Sydney quickly asked his student if he was afraid that the boy had only taken one look at the technology to find its fatal flaw. Dalton speculated that this Jin might be a spy for an unorthodox faction or demonic cult. Sydney disagreed with his student and said that a spy would not attract so much attention, and Dalton suggested that he did it on purpose. However, the leader of the Arhat Hall stated that it didn't matter. Jin was first and foremost a new student and would therefore be under constant surveillance, and then hidden motives would become apparent. Sydney also suggested that this guy might come from a family of martial artists. Dalton agreed with the teacher because he saw Jin doing such strange training on his own, and perhaps he inherited these methods from his family. Sydney reminded that the highest figure in the child's life is his father. It seems to him that Jin just wants to prove that the techniques of his parents are stronger than the thousand-year-old techniques of Shaolin. He beat Harry, so he'll be even more confident. What can they do now? Sydney asked Dalton what if he trusted Bobby with this matter. Dalton asked the teacher in surprise. Wouldn't Bobby be part of the discipline hall? Sydney calmed Dalton down and informed him that he had volunteered to join the Arhat Hall, but Bobby could help them deal with this child. After the evening training, the young monks decided to go to the dormitory and get a good night's sleep. However, they decided to take a different route than usual. All because on their previous route, they noticed a man who was practicing squats. It was Bobby, nicknamed Crazy Dog and Fanatic Rules. He trained in the gym in the evening, but for some reason he came here too, apparently to practice the horseman's pose. Children were wary of him because another nickname of the athlete was the Dog Rules. Everyone knew that Crazy Dog belonged in the disciplinary hall and thought that was where he belonged. However, one monk reported that from tomorrow Bobby will become an Arhat. There were also rumors that he would become the next master. But now they would have to live with that Crazy Dog again. Bobby was one of the influential monk students. He always imposed discipline on others, even if they were senior Shaolin monks. They said that he intended to visit all the halls to thoroughly study the laws of Shaolin and then return to the disciplinary hall. He only thinks about the rules. Bobby, the defender of the laws, tried harder than anyone else. He believed that it was wrong to impose rules on others that you yourself do not follow. Apparently, he also devoted more time to training. Her knees, which were constantly subjected to stress, were in such a state that without using internal energy it was even difficult for him to walk. They were so damaged. But he didn't care about that. He believed that basic toning strengthened the spirit and body. He considered pain to be part of training the mind. Now he had just finished 30 minutes of horseman pose and was thinking about Gina. Bobby saw this promising student as a problem, but was determined to do everything he could to bring him back to the true path of a Shaolin disciple. Soon the young monks saw him in the Arhat Hall and asked what he was doing there. Bobby told them that he would be working here. Jin noted his magnificent body. He looked like a soldier. Many students were surprised that Bobby had moved into their hall. But Jean quickly figured out the situation and realized that this Bobby was a defender of the rules. Bobby declared the training open and decided to get to the root of the problem in order to solve it. The students were practicing their horse stance, and Bobby noticed that Jean was doing it with some confidence. But he inhaled as he moved and exhaled as he rose, and Bobby saw nothing strange or different about it. Could this be some kind of trick to avoid training? Bobby was doing the exercises with everyone else to better teach the young monks, but then Jean approached him. He said the trainer had the wrong stance and thought he would have to teach him the basics. Jean didn't know why Bobby was trying to copy his exercises, but he could hear an unpleasant noise from his joints when he bent his knee. His body is screaming about injury, and no self-respecting coach can ignore that. Jin thought that it would be best to lure such a person to his side. After all, he has power, and his life can become much easier. Jean told Bobby that these exercises would cause more damage if done with damaged knees. Could the teacher do what he told him to do? He showed Bobby the lunge stretch and asked him to do the first set. Jin explained that this was a tendon-lengthening technique and would help relieve tension in the knees. If Bobby does this before his main training sessions, he will be able to move more easily and reduce the load. And the disciplined dog has felt the difference. Jean suggested that he do 3 approaches with 30-second intervals. After that, Jean lightly massaged Bobby's knee. Even light massages hurt him. And Jean knew that these workouts put stress on the joints, and it was no wonder that Bobby got injured. Bobby admitted that at first it hurt from just one touch, but now there was some relief. Jean suggested starting this exercise over again. He nudged Bobby in the back, declaring that training would not wait and that it was necessary to begin immediately. Bobby wondered tensely, who was this Jean? Dalton, watching Bobby and Jean from afar, asked the senior monks what the child was doing to Bobby, and they replied that they had no idea. Jean confidently told Bobby that he needed to do these exercises whenever he felt problems with his knees. Bobby, nicknamed Crazy Dog, has been watching every student nonstop since joining the Shaolin Temple, and everyone has long known how obsessed he is. But now, the same Bobby was training amiably with a new strange monk. Jin told him that they would rest a little and that they would need to repeat this exercise 15 more times. Jin showed Crazy Dog a narrow squat, and Crazy Dog reminded the young monk that he had spoken of the dangers of this exercise, and he explained that his knees were in bad condition. Bobby should bend his legs less to reduce the load. Then Jin decided to tell the senior monk the procedure for the exercise. The first thing you need to do is slowly bend your knees and get into a semi-sitting position. Secondly, do not put pressure on your knees during squats. All the load should be transferred to your hips and buttocks. And the third thing to remember is that when lifting, the load should be distributed in the same direction. Having followed all the instructions of the young monk, Bobby found that his muscles were in full order. The exercises Gene showed Bobby made him feel less pain. Meanwhile, the monk said that when they completed 3 repetitions, they would move on to the calves, and he thought that now he would demonstrate the benefit of a personal experienced trainer. All the clients who looked like soldiers had a frightening appearance, but they easily gave in to good people. Jin complimented Bobby's stance, and he laughed and reminded him that he had been studying at Shaolin for 18 years. The older students watching these two people doing their classes couldn't figure out if Bobby was angry because they were giving him nicknames or if he was just crazy. Dalton got a headache looking at this, so he decided to ignore the couple. It was time for breakfast, and John told Bobby to repeat what he had shown him when he trained his lower body, and it would work best if he did the exercise before he started his main workout. Bobby seemed to be silently following John's instructions, but it was not blind faith. He decided to trust it when he tested the exercises on himself. And the thought he came to after stretching, physical therapy, and massage with a top-notch trainer was the realization that these were excellent techniques. Even Bobby was very surprised by this. Not only was the way of doing the exercises effective, but also the lengthening of the tendons along with the point massage. He almost did not feel the pulsating pain in his knees, and the muscles of his limbs were strongly stretched. Bobby asked the young monk if these techniques were a legacy of his family. They are very efficient, and his family is probably unusual. Everything looks like they have been perfected over generations. Jin was pleased to realize that a very convenient misunderstanding had arisen. Of course, he acted very suspiciously and tried to figure out how to change people's opinions about himself. But the answer came by itself. Jin replied that his family taught him these techniques. However, Bobby stated that his praise only concerns help with knees. They study martial arts that have existed for thousands of years, and, understanding Jin's pride in his family, he still advises him to train at the temple. The young monk promised to remember his words, and Mike turned to him and asked him if he was free yet. Gene said goodbye to Bobby and went with Mike to the dining room. Bobby apologized to Dalton for his indecent appearance, and Dalton laughed and remarked that he had somehow guessed about his secret appearance. Bobby explained his strange actions by saying that he needed to know the enemy in order to defeat him, and Dalton asked what he had managed to learn. Bobby revealed that Jin comes from a family of healers, not martial artists. Dalton asked him to explain why he came to this conclusion. Bobby explained that his knees were in terrible condition after heavy training. He did not bother the teachers and senior monks with his problem, but first of all, he was afraid of showing weakness in front of the juniors. Even the students he had trained with for over 10 years didn't notice anything, but Jin understood everything in an instant. He showed a new move, and now his knees are not so loaded. Dalton grabbed his head with his hands and asked what they should do, because this talented child could destroy the entire Shaolin training system. Bobby reassured Dalton that he would get him back on the right path. The younger ones always listen to the elders with whom they have become close, and instead of forcing them, you can carefully introduce them to the temple's training methods. Dalton agreed with Bobby and suggested not to rush things and do everything carefully. He said that he was counting on Bobby a lot. At the midday training, immediately after breakfast, there were Buddhism lessons, and Jin did not like this. The death of a young organism from malnutrition seemed quite real to him. Dalton announced that everyone had now perfected the sequential strike, and therefore it was time for them to move on to the next stage. The true power of martial arts is only revealed when the internal and external energy are in harmony. And from this day on, they will learn to control the internal energy. Dalton pointed to 2 older students and declared that these people would now demonstrate everything to them. The young monks were asked to assume the lotus position they had learned. The senior students, called upon to demonstrate everything in practice, assumed the lotus position. Dalton told the monks to close their eyes and concentrate on their breathing. Then he ordered me to inhale slowly and deeply through my nose and let the air pass through my throat. They must continue breathing until the air reaches the energy core. Jin was glad that the day had finally come when he would learn real martial arts. Before this, they were only given physical exercise, and he started to get tired. But now they will learn something amazing. Jin wasn't the only one who was waiting for this. After the hard basic training and the blow, everyone had reached the first stage of martial arts, and the new type of training promised to be an incentive for the young monks. They will already be studying the thousand-year-old techniques of Shaolin, and each of them dreams of succeeding and learning to break boulders, as Monk Dalton did. All the students obediently focused on his words and began breathing training. However, Jin noticed something strange about this training. Jin thought that even if this was breathing training, it was different from the one in the novel. Will they not tell them about the Qigong technique or the 8 phases of Fuxi? An hour of training passed, and Jin, who had been challenging Shaolin techniques until now, this time diligently followed the instructions. He decided it was time to study everything properly. He was very excited. The power that allows people to split entire mountains and soar through the sky. The power that goes beyond reality will finally belong to him. He will learn all the most important things from this Murim novel and will be able to use these skills later. Dalton ordered the young monks to open their eyes and stated that the Tonap technique they had just mastered was the easiest way to accumulate energy in their bodies through breathing. And in order to harness the Qigong technique, they needed to feel the energy. They must practice Tonap every day to learn to feel the energy. Jin felt disappointed. That meant they weren't going to study it now. He couldn't believe they would start from the basics. Dalton took out a book and said that for internal energy, one must first feel Qi. He explained that this book depicts the path of energy in the human body. But it is not necessary to memorize the entire book. It is enough to remember the basic information on the path of energy. It is needed to control energy, as well as to subjugate the enemy. Jean happily picked up this book. It was said there about the path of energy along which human energy and strength flows. Along this path flows not only Qi, but also the internal strength of a person. Therefore, before studying martial arts, it is necessary to understand this main element. Dalton told the monks that he would now tell them how everything worked. Jin saw in the book the path along which energy passes, and the young monk decided to remember everything well. In the evening, on his way to the dorm, Jin decided that he needed to learn the basic energy points in the body and practice accumulating energy using Tonap. Once he mastered Tonap, he would be able to master the basic techniques of Shaolin. Then he will be able to practice the Tonap technique right away. In the deserted square, Jin unexpectedly met Bobby and asked him what he was doing there. He replied that his knees hurt less thanks to the technique he taught him, and he began to train more. Jin reminded him that he was simply telling him about an exercise to help his knees heal faster. Bobby said that the more you hit the iron, the stronger it gets. And he showed Jin his hands and said that he had been training them for 18 years. Jin thought with doubt that good muscles could not come from anywhere because there was no quality protein in the diet. And he told the master that iron should be hit moderately, and if you hit it too hard, it will break. The same thing happens with the human body. Jin asked Bobby to sit down. He offered to relax his muscles with a light massage, but warned that it would be a little painful. But pain is normal. That's how it should be. It reminded Jin of the old days when he served in the Special Forces. His body was on the edge from the grueling daily training. Despite the hard work he had done, his many years of service came to an end due to an injury, and he was forcibly discharged. At that time, he was like a lost child. He was very worried. Jin, looking at Bobby, thought that he looked like him from the past. The young monk told Bobby that if his body was to suffer, he would have to bear the responsibility for it himself, so he must take care of his body. Bobby patted the boy on the head and said that he didn't know what he had been through in this world, but they said that Shaolin doesn't abandon its students just because their bodies are in bad shape. Whatever happens, the temple will not abandon its disciple. Jin looked closely into the eyes of his older friend and decided to remember these words. Then Bobby rose to his full gigantic height and declared that from tomorrow onwards, Jin would trust him and begin to practice Shaolin techniques. Then Bobby asked Jin what he was going to do now, and Jin replied that he wanted to practice the Tonap he had learned today. Bobby was surprised that he didn't know about such techniques, coming from such a family. Jin had to answer that he was unable to learn it due to family circumstances, and then Bobby offered him to learn it right there. What if having him nearby performing energy detection techniques would make Jin able to sense the energy much more easily? It sounded very convincing. Even if he tries to feel all the energy, he will not understand what exactly it is like, since he does not know himself. But if someone uses the energy nearby, it can work. Jin assumed the lotus position and informed his mentor that he was ready, and Bobby told him to concentrate. The master wanted Gene to look at him carefully and learn. If it would help him, he would be glad. Gene looked at Bobby, who was meditating, and it seemed to him that the air around him had somehow changed. Gene decided to take advantage of the moment and understand the difference between his energy and Bobby's energy. He saw something, and when he was alone, he did not observe this. A powerful energy was floating around Bobby's body, and Jin realized that this was the very same key. When exhaling through your mouth, you should concentrate all the evil energy in your body and throw it out. And with a deep breath, draw the pure energy of nature into the center of the body. Thus, Gene was able to find the difference between his energy and Bobby's energy. Inhale. Energy. Visualization. Energy flow. It's all very simple. Jin felt this energy. True, it was very small, only the size of a grain of rice. Gene considered this a small miracle, because if you can call chips truffle because they contain an insignificant percentage of truffle, then this can also be called a success. Bobby was surprised that the young man had already begun to feel, and it turned out that what Dalton and Sydney said was the pure truth. This child will become the pillar of Shaolin for 1,000 years. Suddenly, Jin felt that it became colder around him. He came to his senses and saw that it was already late evening outside. Jin apologized to the master and said that he didn't think that time would fly by so quickly. But Bobby advised him to relax and hurry to the dorm because lights out was coming soon. Bobby was amazed that Jin had only just discovered his Kai. It had already reached such a high level. Jin could now also learn the initial technique of Shaolin, the Buddha heart technique. But he asked the master if he shouldn't memorize all the energy paths. Bobby asked him in surprise if he hadn't done it as the son of his family, and Jin was forced to turn it into a joke. Jin was unhappy that the mentor kept asking about his family. He decided that today he had to learn all these paths so that early the next morning he could go to training with a light heart. The mentor suggested that those who had felt and learned the paths of energy should step out of line. Jin took a step forward with pride and was surprised that there were so many children who had learned all the paths of energy and felt the Kai. The mentor informed them that he would tell them their next steps. He showed a book that describes the techniques of the Buddha's heart, the foundation of the Shaolin mind principle. The children listened with special attention to the master, who told them everything thoroughly and consistently. Few believed that Jin had mastered Qi and the ways of energy in just one day. Soon, the master finished his lecture. Mike asked Gene with interest how he managed to learn all this so quickly, and he replied that this was just the beginning and it was not difficult at all. First, the incoming energy must circulate through the body from one place to another, and if it is not directed correctly during the ascent, it can be dangerous. Gene assured Mike that he too could achieve this in no time if he concentrated on his breathing. Jin remembered the entire map and the order of the paths so well that they were well imprinted in his memory. He felt his energy build up faster, as if a number with 4 decimal places had changed to a number with 3 decimal places. It was a lot of fun. He really understood and learned the fighting techniques in the martial arts world and felt like he was growing. Jin's training went smoothly. He learned to control his breathing and energy. He was distracted from his work by the voice of Mike, who was dragging the body of some young monk on his back. Jin asked him in surprise where he found the body. Mike replied that it was not just a body, this guy was being punished. Henry was punished for entering the mountain early, and Gene asked why he was carrying him. Mike replied that he couldn't carry it any other way because Henry was very heavy. Gene decided to assess the guy's condition. He leaned down to his face and studied it carefully. The body and face were stained with dirt from Michael carrying him low to the ground. But it was obvious that someone had beaten him badly. Henry had many bruises and abrasions, and there was blood on his clothes. Jin couldn't remember why this guy's name was so familiar to him. Unlike other children, he had an emaciated appearance, sunken cheeks, and a thin body. It seemed that Jean remembered Henry, but the memory that had just popped into his head was of a completely different kind. He didn't remember the face, but the name seemed very familiar to him. But now Jean was wondering why Henry had been sentenced to this beating. Mike didn't know either, but Jean decided to find out. Since Henry had such marks, he had an idea. He said it was best to find out from someone who knew something for sure. If he was sentenced to this, then there is definitely a person who climbed the mountain before him. This is the man with whom he once had a sparring session. They went to this man to ask some questions. Mike knew that Harry was the first of all the students to go to the mountains, so if anyone could know something, it was him. Harry frowned and asked why he should take up precious training time to talk to them. Jin also asked him, isn't he the master's best disciple and aren't disciples more important than training? Harry asked the monk since when he became his disciple, and he replied that it meant he liked it when the disciple beat him. Harry replied that he was in a bad mood at the time. Jean noted that this was probably the whole point. Harry first lost to the weak and then called the teacher for help. Harry rushed at Gin with his fists, but again, just like last time, he fell for this strange technique called twisting, and Harry again gave in to Gin. The young monk told him that even if he fought with him 100 times, he would not succeed, so why did he lose? Genie offered Harry a deal. If he told why Henry was in such a state, he would tell why he lost. Jin saw that in front of him was a proud man who had been defeated by a technique unknown to him, and he must have been very curious about why he had lost. Jean suggested that Harry first tell why Henry was in such a state. Harry replied that it was because he was beaten by Matt and his henchmen. He is the only son of Mr. Bill from the Shaolin side clan. Henry is the son of the master of a side clan. It is said that Master Morgan went to take Matt as an apprentice, but there he noticed Henry's talent, and so took him along with Matt. The problem was that Matt started to bully Henry, saying that he was beneath him. But there's nothing to be done about it. His father works for Matt. How can he resist? John asked furiously. But this is the Shaolin Temple where they teach the way of Buddha. Why didn't he do anything? Isn't he the strongest here? Harry replied that there was nothing he could do. There were 3 opponents, and it was hard to deal with one, but how could he deal with 3 at once? And Jean interjected that Mike said that he was the strongest. Harry replied that Mike saw him that way because he, like them, was not very well trained. These guys come from collateral families. Of course, the martial arts of the branch families are based on the martial arts of Shaolin, so they already know the basics and therefore are not as diligent in training. Jin thought about the guy who had come forward with him today, but he seemed to be a poor student. At that moment, Henry woke up and couldn't understand where he was. He was even afraid that the guys around him might beat him up. Jack reassured Henry and said that his circumstances were familiar to him. He felt sorry for the boy because he was beaten and humiliated and became so fearful. How could school violence even exist in the Shaolin Temple? Henry's father works for Matt's father. The guy could turn to Morgan for help, but he is obviously afraid of retribution. Jean turned to Henry and said that he could help him if he listened to him carefully. He suggested reporting those guys who had been bothering him in Haejong to Master Morgan. Henry replied that they would not leave his father alone. Jin remarked that everything would be resolved easily if he became Junshun's disciple. This is a student who continues his studies while living in the main hall. The disciples of the side clans usually come from outside, and no matter how high their position, they cannot just touch a Junshun disciple who belongs to Shaolin. However, not everyone can become a Junshun disciple. Everyone understood the purpose of Jin's proposal, except Mike. Jin assured the boys that the pitiful disciples from the side clan would not be able to threaten the disciple of Genshin from Shaolin and his father. Shaolin will never turn away from its student, no matter what happens. The temple will never allow these guys to do whatever they want. John approached Henry and asked him if he would agree to try. Jin asked Henry in surprise. Why was he shaking? Was it because he didn't have the confidence to become Janshun's disciple? He still wants his father to continue toiling for a family that treats him like shit? But if he gives in, his father will still have to dance to Matt's tune. Henry shook Jin's outstretched hand and said he would try. Jin smiled and said that it was a good idea, and it was time to talk about their second plan. It's not possible to continue to suffer until he becomes a student. It's not difficult. First, they'll beat Matt. 3 days later, during their free afternoon, the 3 students gathered at a place they knew. Matt's friends asked him if Henry would come today, and he replied that of course he would. Matt stated that he told Henry that if he didn't come, his family would suffer. Aubrey, Matt's first henchman, said that they hadn't flexed their fists in a long time, and the second henchman, Ryan, added that they couldn't miss 2 days off. Aubrey noticed that Henry was hanging out with some strange guys now, but Ryan calmed his comrade down and said that it was the crazy Gene and the idiot Mike. Matt said they had another restless guy with them, and it looked like they were all going to show up here today. Matt thought that everything was going well, because he already wanted to beat up that idiot Gene once. He was not at all smart and he didn't like how proud he was. Aubrey reminded his friends of Henry's humiliating sobs, and Matt assured him that he would make him cry this time too. At this time, Jin called out to the guys and asked what they had said about the proud one. Was that really how he seemed to them? Matt's team saw that Henry had brought 3 more with him. They weren't afraid of Genie, even though he had defeated that healthy Harry. Harry promised to make sure that such crap didn't come out of their mouths again. The opponents came closer and it looked like a fight was inevitable. Jean said that Henry decided to deal with Matt himself and asked him not to forget what he taught him. Matt said mockingly that it seemed like Henry had made some friends and he even envied him. He walked up to Henry and asked if he was really going to hit him. Henry got into a fighting stance, and Matt still didn't believe that the guy would be able to attack him. Matt said his father would get in trouble if he did that. Henry felt furious as he imagined his father's face. Jin had told him the day before that if he didn't want his father to suffer, there was only one way. He had to beat up those guys and become Janshan's disciple. Henry struck his attacker. Matt couldn't believe it. He was broken not only physically but also mentally. The others also fought their own battles. Harry looked very scary to his opponent, and even the atmosphere around him changed. He too had been indignant before. Why on earth was Jin interfering in his affairs, but still did not refuse to help and agreed to participate in this fight. He decided to join the students and Jin suggested continuing the conversation. He was surprised that he lost to him every time. Now he would tell him the reason. Jin explained that his consecutive punching technique is indeed fast and powerful, but that's not all. Jin challenged Harry to test himself and dodge his first attack with this technique. Harry managed to dodge the blow. Jin attacked with his second form and Harry dodged it. The next blow was difficult to dodge because, contrary to expectations, Jin struck from below and deceived Harry. So the young monk explained to him that you can't just stand and take the blow, you need to act more cunningly. He must always deceive his opponent, although his blows are both fast and powerful. But that's not all, because before he strikes, his stance makes it clear. Harry objected and said that if the blow was so fast, then even if you predicted it, it would be impossible to stop it. You just had to hit quickly and hard. Jin agreed with him and said that someday, far in the future, if he decided to become the strongest in the world, then his words would have power. Conversely, if he is not the strongest in the world, then this does not apply to him. So, until then, he needs to use cunning. Harry decided that from now on, he would attack him with the first form of the punching technique and let him try to dodge it. Jin told Harry that while he was unable to attack so quickly that his opponent would not block the blow even if he knew it was coming, he should use a well-placed deception. Harry thought he had never thought about it, and it always seemed like a cowardly thing to him. But Jin was right. Why was using stealth considered cowardice? Harry, in gratitude for the useful information, decided to share something with Jin. He advised the young monk not to underestimate Matt and his henchmen. Jin looked at him in surprise and asked, because he said earlier that he was stronger than them, and Harry replied that he did not fight with all his strength. If it is a real fight and not sparring, he will use his family's martial arts and accumulated skills too. The boys went to a remote corner where there could be no one except them. Harry brought his comrades here because he didn't want to get into trouble with the elders for carelessly using the family martial arts. He asked Mike to stand guard and promised to surprise everyone. Harry concentrated and a light aura appeared around his body. The young man assumed a fighting stance and demonstrated several movements. Jin noted that his technique was indeed different from when he used only consecutive punches. The power and speed were very good, about the level of a school boxer. Of course, it wasn't as strong as Jin imagined, but considering Harry's age, he was definitely a monster. Every time this guy kicks or punches, the sound of the wind echoes, so that's why he said it's dangerous for everyone. Harry told his comrades that if he fought Matt's henchmen, they would also use their martial arts against him. Jin told Harry that he was impressed by his skills. He really is the strongest among the young monks, but he still can't control his internal energy freely. Harry assured that he could handle it, and now he suggested that the enemy attack. Jin looked at Harry and that guy. He realized that in order to use internal energy, you need to strike in a given form and style. Also, compared to Harry, his punching ability is like that of a newborn. The martial art he used was consistent strikes, and in the end, all his movements were predictable. Harry's opponent dodged. This time he wasn't just lucky. Now it was Harry's turn to attack his opponent, who nervously asked him not to come closer. He protected his face, and Harry, following Jin's instructions, fainted and hit him in the stomach. The enemy screamed from surprise and pain. He fell to the ground, and Harry stood over him in a fighting stance. The guy that Jin knocked out started crying and promised to tell his father everything. The young monk noticed that he had been bullying Henry and was now whining about it. Jin looked around to assess the actions of his comrades and realized that he was worried in vain. Everyone dealt with their opponents perfectly. Not only was the outcome of Henry's fight unknown, but then Jin heard some strange sound. Henry, kneeling before his fallen opponent, continued to beat his motionless body. Jin rushed towards him, calling on Henry to stop the beating, and then he finally remembered where he had heard that name. He turns the enemy's face into a bloody mess. His hands are stained red with someone else's blood, and his eyes sparkle with madness while blood is smeared across his face. There was no doubt it was him, a character from his favorite author's first novel called The Return of the Demon Lord. He was the most insane villain, the one who loves blood the most, Bloody Monk Henry. This was Jin's favorite novel as a child, although much time has passed since then, and some of it has already been forgotten. But somewhere in the distant corners of memory, an illustration of one character has been preserved. A mad monk who claimed that all people are evil. He claimed that he would wash away their sins with his own blood. The scene that Jean saw now reminded him of the madness and fear of the hero Henry from that very novel. Jin blamed himself for the fact that his advice had awakened the boy's anger and rage. He just wanted to boost his self-esteem, but he woke up a real demon. If nothing was done now, Matt could die from the beating. Jean called Mike for help and rushed to Henry. The two of them somehow managed to pull the resisting Henry away from Matt. Having calmed down, Henry began to cry. It looks like he hasn't yet become a bloody monk. If Jean's memory served him correctly, the character was simply crazy, and it was never explained why he went crazy. Continuing to endure bullying and torment, Henry eventually crossed the line. At this time, Bobby's figure appeared at the scene. He looked at Jean intently and said that he would have to explain what was going on here. Bobby looked carefully at the scene of the massacre. Jean drew Bobby's attention to Henry's wounded body. Bobby was surprised and amazed by what he saw. He again demanded clear explanations. Jin explained that the scars he could see now were made by those who were now lying on the ground in this alley. They had been tormenting Henry for the last 2 months. Today, these three were going to do the same to him, so he and his friends intervened. He asked the groaning students if what Jin said was true. He told them to look him straight in the eye and promised to punish them if they lied. Aubrey and Ryan didn't answer. They just whined. Bobby was determined to find out what really happened here. He turned to Henry and ordered him to answer. Jean took him by the shoulder and asked him to tell it like it was because Bobby was a very fair man. Henry replied that Jean had not lied and that he had been beaten by Matt, Aubrey, and Ryan for the past 2 months. Henry, bursting into tears, began to tell in a trembling voice about what he had to go through during this time. His story was somewhat abrupt due to strong emotions, but the gist of his words still got through to Bobby. Jin turned to the master and reminded Bobby of the words that the temple does not abandon its students under any circumstances and called on him to protect Shaolin student Henry. Bobby objected and said that the injured children were students too. Jin asked him if those who threaten the life of a child can be considered students of a famous school. Is this really the spirit of Shaolin? Bobby looked very closely into the young monk's eyes. Jean was right. Sydney stated that Jean would be right if everything Henry said was true. So because of what happened, they were starting an investigation today. The leader of the Arhat Hall added that if his words were not a lie, these children would stop being Shaolin students. Jin expressed hope that a fair investigation would be conducted. Sydney held out his open palm and said that even if these children were to cease being Shaolin students in the future, what had happened could not be ignored, because the point of martial arts was to pacify, not fight, children. He asked Jean if too much force had been used on Matt. Henry apologized and was about to confess what he had done. However, Jin got ahead of his comrade and took the blame for beating Matt on himself, explaining that he was very angry and could not control his emotions. He thought that if he abandoned Henry now and shifted the blame onto him, he could at any moment become a bloody monk again. But if he keeps an eye on him to make sure that doesn't happen, he can become his best friend. To enter the Buddhist path, there is a special place for practice called facing the wall. Jin had to spend the next 7 days and nights without talking to anyone, constantly looking at the wall in the cave and meditating. Bobby walked the young monk to the cave and told him that his punishment would take place here. In the cave, he must maintain the correct posture and meditate facing the wall. He must not look around even while sleeping and eating. And as for the latter, he will periodically bring him water and food. Jin walked inside the cave and sat down against the wall to begin his meditation. He knew that all the works of his favorite author would have roughly the same thing, and despite the fact that he was reborn as a Shaolin monk, a character from The Return of the Ultimate Demon appeared here. Return of the Absolute Demon and Tyranny of the Unorthodox Faction are works that share the same universe. But not only do they have one world, but also the time in which both main characters act is the same. However, they worked in different places and rarely met. Also, the second part of Tyranny introduces the Shaolin protagonist, a divine monk. And if the plots of the two stories take place at about the same time, his actions may well influence the events in the other works. What should he do then if his intervention will cause a butterfly effect and disrupt the development of other main characters? Jin decided that he needed to gain experience to become stronger, because he remembered almost nothing from these stories except the growth of the characters. This is not surprising, because more than 10 years have passed, and the whole plot is remembered only in general terms, not to mention the details. However, if the entire novel goes wrong because of the main characters, then he is not sure that Divine Monk Shaolin will remain unchanged. But since he was able to cope even with Henry, the future bloody monk, then the rest will be within his power. The protagonist of Return of the Ultimate Demon gains enlightenment and becomes stronger in the final battle with the bloody monk. And the bloody monk disappeared because of him, which means the main character will no longer be able to reach the same level of strength. It was all very complicated, and Jin was frantically thinking about where he should start and what to do next. Bobby, watching Jin from the shadows, was surprised by his discipline. It seemed like the guy was focused solely on his repentance. The amazing concentration and intelligence at only 12 years old can certainly become the backbone of their 1,000-year-old Shaolin. And some time ago in Sydney's office, the leader of the hall said that all this happened because of his immorality. He didn't keep an eye on it. Sydney asked Dalton how the investigation was going. He replied that they had interviewed all the new students and their testimonies had matched. Henry had indeed been constantly bullied, and this incident was a shadow of shame for the Shaolin Temple. At this time, Bobby entered the room and Sydney invited him to sit down. He asked the chief if he noticed anything special. Henry's hands and face indicate that he was the one who beat Matt, and Jean appears to have taken the blame to protect his friend. Misfortune and blessing met under the sky, but good always triumphs over evil. And if Jean had not intervened, something worse than a simple fight could have happened. Bobby stated that he had a dissenting opinion about what happened, and Sydney asked him to speak. Bobby said that something like this couldn't be attributed to just one person. Everyone was at fault, and instead of blaming or regretting what happened, wouldn't it be better to focus on preventing similar incidents in the future? Sydney asked Bobby if he had a plan. He believed that the main reason for the quarrels between students was the lack of training. They had a lot of strength left to dare to start a fight like that, and to prevent something like that from happening in the future, he planned to pay more attention to their physical training. The chief agreed with his words and, due to his busy schedule, left everything to Bobby and Dalton. Sydney emphasized that first it would be necessary to punish 3 students whose crimes had already been proven, and for this he was heading to the disciplinary room. Bobby, watching Jean sit motionless, thought that he too would do everything he could to guide the students along the right path. Realizing that further observation was unnecessary, Bobby returned to the temple, deciding that tomorrow at dawn he would visit the monk again. Jean smiled as Bobby left. 7 years in the Special Forces had not been wasted, and he could now detect someone else's presence in no time. Jin couldn't understand what he was supposed to do here for 7 whole days. If he started training, he wouldn't be able to replenish his protein reserves without beans and mushrooms. He couldn't even remember the last time he ate meat. Before he came here, he definitely ate chicken with a crispy skin and tender flesh inside. He needed meat. Then it occurred to the young monk that he could obtain meat food himself. He made and set snares to catch rabbits. This was a source of protein. At the same time, not far from Mount Song, where the Shaolin Temple is located, in Yichun province, the temple's disciples were collecting information. By asking ordinary residents, they managed to hear many local stories. After some time, they gathered at the gate of the Western Temple. Hans, the deputy head outside the walls of Shaolin, introduced himself to the Sobel Bureau official. Bureau Chief Preston, Matt's father, greeted him warmly. He said it was a great honor for him to meet the 5 undefeated strikes great martial artist Gans. He asked to explain what was wrong with his son. Hans looked gloomily into Preston's eyes and he realized that this meeting would not bring him anything good. Hans turned to Preston and said that Matt's appearance was the result of his own evil deeds. Instead of training to purify his body and mind, he abused his comrades, causing chaos in Shaolin itself. In addition, after surveying the area, they discovered something. The Sobel Bureau extorts money and intimidates commoners. This is unworthy of a family that practices Shaolin. Hans ordered his subordinates to immediately deprive these people of martial arts. Preston, in turn, turned to his guards and ordered them to stop the Shaolin students. A fight broke out between 2 groups of fighters. As expected, the monks of the temple gained the upper hand. Hans ordered that all that Preston had unjustly acquired should be returned to the common people and asked the crowd if Avon's benefactor was here. Avon raised his hand and asked what happened. Hans bowed before the man and asked for forgiveness, because the student Matt had bullied was none other than his son Henry. Avon couldn't believe that they dared to abuse his boy in the Shaolin Temple. The monk apologized again for not being able to prevent this earlier, but the temple would take full responsibility for what happened. They would find another master for Evan, connected to Shaolin, who, unlike Preston, would be honest and decent. While hunting rabbits, Jean found someone's traps that were very poorly made. It was similar to the rabbit one he had made yesterday, but it looked different and was made disgustingly. Could it be that other people live on this mountain? And suddenly the young monk heard a noise in the nearby bushes. Someone hiding there started to run away. Jin rushed after him. He caught the stranger and saw that it was a girl. He couldn't understand why such a beautiful girl was walking along a dangerous path, and she couldn't understand what she'd done wrong. The genie offered the girl something to eat because she looked hungry. She was trying to make a rabbit trap. She asked the novice monk in surprise if he could eat meat. Jin replied that he had a special reason for this, and she shouldn't bother her head with such a trifle. It would be better if she told how she ended up here, because this is the territory of Shaolin, and judging by her clothes, she is from a rich family. The girl was silent because her father had abandoned her. She didn't understand why everyone hated her and assumed it was because she was useless. Jin guessed that this girl had something that she didn't want to talk about and changed the subject. He asked the girl to keep the fact that he hunted rabbits a secret. She asked if it was because he was not allowed to eat meat. And the young monk replied that there were other reasons, and in return he promised to help her return home. Jin told her that a naked monk of some status would soon appear here, and he could easily help her. When the girl asked how he knew this, Jin replied that he could sense her presence. All she has to do is wait patiently for this monk near the cave. When Bobby was at the entrance to the cave, he suddenly heard a voice asking for help. Behind the tree trunk, he found a girl who told him that she had become separated from her companions and lost her way. Bobby volunteered to bring her home. He asked her if she had seen the boy from the cave by any chance. Jin, hearing their entire dialogue from the cave, froze. The girl realized why this guy was so eager to keep his rabbit hunt a secret. She answered the monk that she had not seen anyone nearby and was afraid to approach the cave. Bobby decided that while Jean was meditating, he could help this girl. He asked the girl to follow him to go down the mountain and find her house. Then Bobby asked her name and heard that her name was Sabrina. Jean heard that Bobby and Sabrine had left. The young monk regretted that he had forgotten to ask the girl's name, although he did not think that they would meet her again. Bobby called out to Henry to talk to him. It concerned his father. Bobby told Henry everything that had happened in the village, including the fact that the Subali Bureau, which Matt's parent had run, no longer existed. He also said that the monks had given his father a new job, and from now on, he should not worry about worldly affairs and should devote himself entirely to his studies. Henry bowed respectfully and promised to do his best. He declared that he would definitely become a student of Jianshan. Jin was not mistaken. Shaolin turned out to be a place that did not abandon its students. On the fourth day of his imprisonment, Jin caught another rabbit, which was not difficult for him, because during his training in the special forces, survival training was conducted and, naturally, this included methods for learning how to obtain food. The only thing he forgot when he was frying meat for that girl was that lighting an open fire while hunting could expose him. After something like this, it would be best to move to another cave to cover up the traces of your presence. Cleaning should not be forgotten either. Therefore, in order to minimize the formation of garbage, he did not even remove the skin from the meat. It was already smeared with dirt, but he did not care even about this. Jin ate everything as it was. The cooked meat wasn't great, but he was able to replenish his protein reserves and finally remembered what meat tasted like. It was the fifth day of Jin's sentence. He woke up before the morning bell and began to meditate, looking at the wall. But this didn't mean that he was so diligent. He just knew that he was being watched from time to time. Bobby never ceased to be amazed at Jean's diligence and discipline in constantly meditating. He may have even spent the whole night like this. Bobby brought food and drink, but Jean was not even distracted by the extraneous sound, continuing to meditate. Bobby left the food and water and walked away. Jin waited until the master's footsteps died away. He looked at the things he had left behind and thought that forcing the child to eat only this for a whole week was really too much. This meager food was given to him once a day. But he made up for his lack of energy by hunting and had even become accustomed to this routine. The sixth day of seclusion has arrived. According to the rules, after the body has received a sufficient amount of protein and energy, it is necessary to move on to training. It was necessary to perform as many exercises as possible. As Jin continued to train his body, he realized one thing. The breathing technique during the exercises is similar to toe nap. So he started his own training, combining spiritual development with fitness. He felt like his body had been cleansed after finishing the training, but there was something he didn't know. In fact, these were real trainings that existed in this world called Hang-On. On the seventh day, Bobby came to the cave and told Jean that the meditation at the wall was over and he had done it. Jean asked the master if he could speak yet, and Bobby gave permission. He also said that since dawn was coming soon, they would immediately head to the training ground. Soon they were walking along a path through the forest. Jean asked Bobby how Henry's case ended. He replied that after investigating Matt's family, it turned out that the head of the bureau, Sobel, had caused a lot of trouble in the village. The temple has completely stripped them of all privileges, and Father Henry now works for the new owner. Bobby informed Jean that during his time in seclusion, the intensity of his training had increased. According to the agreement, these trainings did not affect him, but now he will have to participate in Shaolin training on an equal basis with the others. Jean realized that Bobby still hadn't changed his mind. He asked the master if simply increasing the intensity would be enough. Maybe he would let him train on his own? They approached the Nahandan training ground and Bobby replied that he would decide the matter later. The young monks were very happy about Jin's return. Mike rushed to his friend and asked if it was hard for him, and he in turn asked how difficult the training was. Jin replied that for him it was just a walk in the park. Here the students heard the master's address. He announced the start of the pre-dawn training session and called everyone to take their places. Everyone saw on the parade ground bags of sand that the master was distributing to his students. They were distributed to increase the load. Jin wondered doubtfully, was that really the only reason why training was difficult? Weighted down with sand, the students began their incorrect training again at dawn, performing the horseman's pose. Not only were the workouts incorrect, but the exercises were also twice as difficult. But while the others were sweating, Jin found another use for it. He used sandbags as dumbbells, because the sandbags had poor balance. But at that age, you don't need to have the body of a bodybuilder, so it was fine as is. Dalton noticed that Jean was training strangely and did not feel the atmosphere that reigned on the parade ground. Bobby personally volunteered to sort this out. The senior monks were delighted to think that Bobby was about to scold Jean. Bobby thought with annoyance that despite the fact that he had warned him about the difficulty of the training, Jean still planned to do everything his own way. Here he stopped in surprise, watching Jean work. He saw that he was sweating more than the others. Were his exercises really more difficult than what he had come up with? In addition, Bobby noticed some kind of glow around the boy. Is this really Hengon?